Non-Monogamy Help is a podcast where your questions about open, non-monogamous or polyamorous relationships are answered. Our host, Lola Phoenix, will consult a licensed therapist with over a decade of experience to address your problems. Names and locations have been changed or censored to keep your questions anonymous. You're listening to Non-Monogamy Help, the podcast.
Hello and welcome to episode 59 of the Non-Monogamy Help podcast. I'm Lola Phoenix. Please send your questions to nonmonogamyhelp@gmail.com and they'll either be read in the podcast or the column anonymously. If you want to read the columns and listen to the podcasts, you can do so at nonmonogamyhelp.com. You can subscribe to our newsletter by going to go.nonmonogamyhelp.com/email. And you can follow us on Twitter at Non-Monogamy Help. If you want to be amazing, I would really appreciate if you could become a patron. Even just $1 a month can help support the daily running of the columns and the podcasts. And it just shows a general vote of support, and I really appreciate it. You can do that by going to patreon.com/Lola Phoenix. If you donate $5 or more a month, your name, with your permission, will be read at the end of the podcast. So, let's get to this week's discussion question. If this is the first episode you're listening to, every week before I read the letter, I put forth a discussion question that you can use with your friends, partners, and anyone else you want to get to know a little bit more. I also answer it myself briefly, and I try to keep it brief to give you a little bit of context. So, this week's discussion question is, how do you prefer to end a relationship? And because we kind of always assume that it's better to do it in person than to do it over text or to do it over Messenger. And I think this is an interesting question because this episode isn't actually coming out until I think around June 2021, but I'm actually recording it in September 2020. So right now, there's probably going to be a second lockdown coming in the way in the UK from COVID-19, and I think that puts in a lot of interesting questions about whether or not you can do some things in person. My answer to the question is that it really depends on the person. I do think that there are sometimes issues of safety and doing things in person. If you really feel like that person is going to make things really difficult for you, I can't really blame somebody who doesn't really want to do it in person. But, I don't know, I think it just depends on the situation, but I think I try to do things in person. I mean, the one time that I have broken up with someone, I kind of felt like it wasn't like I came to the decision to break up with them and then I met them in person and it was like the whole reason. It was just like in the middle of another argument, and I just kind of dawned on me, I guess, that this wasn't going to work out, and I suggested that to them and their response was to shrug at me. So I kind of felt like, yeah, that was my answer as to whether or not this was really going to work out. Kind of sad. Anyway, I don't have a preference for how to end a relationship, but I guess when it comes to me, it just depends. I think I could definitely see the benefit of being broken up with over like Messenger or something like that because, you know, not having to be in public and like crying in public, I would kind of prefer that. So I guess it depends is my answer. Anyway, that's all the answering that I'm going to do for this question. So let me just repeat the question again. How do you prefer to end a relationship? We always assume that in person is better, but is it? So yeah, let's get to this week's letter. So before COVID, I started developing feelings for a close friend with benefits. I haven't felt this intense about a companionship in years. We worked on some creative projects together and we helped each other with our careers. I started to become friendly but not intimate with his fiancée, but I was open to develop something with them, potentially a throuple or be part of their constellation. But it never got there. I got very sick, probably from COVID 2 weeks before lockdown, and then lockdown happened. During this time, we all kept in contact, texting each other at least once a week. I was doing a lot of self-reflection, working on feelings about this, and being polyam, reading books, reading self-help books, and talking with friends who were in open relationships. I was feeling pretty heartbroken from not being able to see them. It hurt so much, I needed to talk about it. I had a really heartfelt conversation with one I was closest to, and it ended on a really positive note. We agreed that it is uncertain where we are going to go or how this will develop, but it is clear that there were some strong feelings between us that we were both excited to explore. Then the city started to open up. I expressed interest in meeting up somehow, but it never seemed to work out. Not sure if that was intentional or not. I saw them both by chance at a protest for a brief minute, but we all got lost in the crowd. We started to grow apart, less texting. Then I noticed that they went on a vacation with 2 of their friends, possibly other companions, not sure, but I felt really left out. A little bit before this point, I was having mental health issues from all of the changes in my life from COVID, so I stopped initiating conversations through text, at which point our channel of communication basically stopped. He then recently released a project I was part of without much notice, and I just have a lot of conflicting feelings about it because of all this. I understand COVID really has been shaking things up, and I don't want to blame, but I feel really neglected. It kind of feels like I break up with folks before I even get to develop a relationship with them, which really hurts. At this point, though, I feel so burnt out by the situation, I'm not sure I want to continue to be intimate in the future without any commitment on their part, but still open to be friends. Do you think it's worth trying to salvage something from this situation? Am I being too clouded by the hard circumstances and mental health stuff I am in at the moment? Should I be doing things differently? Part of me hopes that we can one day mend this, but part of me would rather move on and find folks who are going to meet my needs better. What are your thoughts? Before we get to this week's answer, I'm going to quickly plug this episode's sponsor, BetterHelp. Quite often in a lot of my columns and podcasts, I encourage people to seek a polyamory-friendly therapist, and for a lot of people, looking locally for that kind of a therapist might not be in the budget or might not be possible. The good thing about BetterHelp is that it allows you to find therapists online that you can send messages to at any time of the day, and it does offer some financial aid. You can get 10% off your first month by using the promo code Non-Monogamy Help or going to betterhelp.com/non-monogamy help. Let's get to this week's answer. So I think that the first thing that you should do is think about, and this might be something that is quite difficult for you, think about what it is that you want or expect out of the situation. And, if you're just starting off trying out polyam, it might be hard for you to really know what that is. And sometimes I do think that we can sometimes end up in situations where we don't know that a need isn't being met until we're kind of hurting from it not being met, and that really sucks to be in. But I do think that the first thing that might be helpful in approaching them is understanding what it is that you want or expect. Now, you kind of have a good idea of that because you talk about commitment, but I think that you need to establish what commitment really means. What are you hoping to be in their lives? Are you really wanting this throuple situation? I mean, I'm always really, really hesitant. I'm assuming that they didn't approach you as a couple. It just so happened that you were interested in both of them. If they approached you as a couple, I'm just really, really hesitant about people who date as couples, because I've written in a whole article about it, or a whole column about it. It tends to be a thing that people do because they think it's safer than dating individually, and I'm not saying this is always the case, because sometimes it's not, but it tends to be something that indicates that they aren't really having the conversations in between them, and they're sort of dating as a couple as a fail-safe because they think it's just easier, or they don't trust one another and they need to be present while the other is dating somebody else because they're worried about being accused of or cheating, and that just doesn't bode well in general. But if they didn't approach you as a couple and you just so happened to have some interest in both of them but naturally developed into being closer to one of them just because you met that person first, that's fine. But I do think you need to think about, what is polyam to you? What is non-monogamy to you? What do you envision your life being like? Are you more of a solo polyam person where you don't really have any established primaries or even people that you live with? Do you want to live with partners? It may be a situation where you're kind of open to different aspects, but clearly I think the fact that you're hurting in this situation, which makes sense, means that you do want something more. And I think that just saying commitment isn't really clear, because the thing that you have to remember is that with monogamy, you're kind of operating with a cultural script that everyone sort of knows. If you haven't read it before, there's a really great article called The Relationship Escalator, and I think there's been the same person who wrote books about it. I'm not quite sure, but the article itself I have read, and I think that really illustrates the kind of script people have. The thing that people kind of know indicates commitment within monogamy, people kind of have a shared definition of that. But when you're in a non-monogamous relationship or polyamorous relationship, you kind of have to come up with your own definitions of what commitment means and what it is that symbolizes commitment. So I think that that's the first thing. The second thing is that I think that you're not really on the same page, because when you talked about this discussion that you had, it seemed like you were kind of breaking up with them, because you kind of both acknowledged that you did want to continue things, but COVID was restricting you from meeting in person. It may be possible that neither one of them do long distance very well and just aren't very good communicators when it's not in person. And so maybe that in that discussion that you had, that really good discussion you had, maybe their understanding was that things were at a pause. So they don't see the point in reaching out and trying to continue that, and don't see the point in inviting you to go on a vacation with someone who they maybe shared, like, met with or close were with, so it's less of a COVID risk, or, you know, that they already had prior experience with. So I think you need to have a better clarifying discussion, because it could be that in that conversation you both walked away with different understandings of where exactly you were. And I also think one thing to flag up about this is that if you want to date them as individuals, then you can't use the person that you're closest to as a kind of communication conduit. You do need to have separate conversations with them instead of treating them as a unit. Like, I think that's one thing to note. But you have kind of continued the establishment of the communication. And I think it's fair for you to feel like, okay, I stopped communicating and then I basically fell off the earth to them and they stopped initiating discussions with me. I wouldn't necessarily assume that that is because they don't care about you or they're not interested in you. They may just think things are at a pause, and that you will get in touch, and if and when things clear up and people can start meeting regularly in person, maybe they, are waiting for you to initiate that. I mean, who knows? I can sit here and I can postulate on what's going inside their minds as much as possible, but you're not going to know until you actually have that conversation with them. And the thing of it is I totally understand half of your brain that's like, man, I just need to get away from this situation because I'm having to initiate all of the discussions. Now that I'm not initiating anything, they're not initiating anything with me. Screw this. Like, I totally get that, because I quite often feel that way. And I do think that this is probably how 98.9% of my online dating conversations end, because I have actually found it really, really important that people at least meet me halfway. And I know that sometimes people struggle with online communication. I know that sometimes people struggle to start conversations. But at the end of the day, whether it's due to shyness or they're just not interested in me, I want to have relationships with people who can actually start a conversation with me, or who have some interest in my life enough to talk to me. I am not going to be the one that initiates 80% of the conversations. I want a little bit more. 40% I'll take from them. But I can't, I hate that, and I'm not going to do that. And I totally get where you're coming from on that. And I do think that's not a bad position to be in. And I do think that when you talk about what you need from them, you need to bring the fact that you initiate most of the conversations up with them and be like, look, I can't be the only one initiating conversations here. I don't want it to be that way. So yeah, I do think that that's fair. But what I would say is, because your last conversation with them to me sounded like a pause, it didn't sound like, okay, we're still dating. It sounded like, well, COVID has happened, we can't meet up in person, so it'd be nice to explore this, but let's explore this later on when we can actually meet up more in person. That's what that sounded like to me. Who knows what kind of impression? You need to have more of a clear discussion with them. Give people a chance to meet your needs before you decide that they can't. You've already established this bond with this person. You've already put some effort in. So I do think that you should at least give them the chance to not meet your needs before you decide that they can't. Okay? Have a sit-down discussion with them over the phone, over Zoom, whatever you need to. It's okay for you to feel left out and all this stuff, but I don't think that that was necessarily deliberate. make sure you're clear on where you're at. Are you still interested in dating as much as you can? Is this thing at a pause? Do they need to initiate more discussions with you? Where are things at? Because it could just be that you guys walked away, or y'all walked away from that situation with 2 different understandings or 3 different understandings of where you're at. To sum up, I think that you need to think about what it is that you would like out of polyamory or non-monogamy. Where do you see it fitting into your life? That may be fluid, that may be something that you don't know just yet, but have a think. At least have a think about it. Because if you think about it, monogamy, like, people think about what they want out of monogamy, even though monogamy is kind of like, well, the way it's presented is like one picture, and it's like marriage, and this is kids, and this is what you're gonna do. People envision that and think about that all throughout their adolescence. So they have a million chances to think about what it is that they want out of monogamy before they actually ever even think of getting into a serious adult relationship. So if you think about it, you need to have a couple of things yourself about what polyamory is to you, what it means to you, what your life will look like in the most ideal state, and that can give you an idea of what your wants and needs are and make it just a little bit more clear to them, other than just saying, I need you to be more committed, because that could mean anything to anybody. Have a sit down, clarifying discussion about where things are, what it is your needs are, tell them what your needs are. And really, I don't know if you should have like a 3 meeting. I don't know. I'm very hesitant to suggest thruppledom, just because I tend to think that complicates things more than it needs to be. Have a sit-down discussion with each of them, or at least the person that you feel closest to right now, and figure out what it is that you need, and give them a chance. Give either him or both of them the chance to actually meet your needs before you decide that they can't. I think that's pretty much what I have to say about this situation. I do totally understand how you feel. The frustration is serious. The frustration is real. I am a 99.9% initiator, so I feel your pain. I hope it helps, and good luck. Thank you for listening to episode 59 of the Non-Monogamy Help podcast. If you want to be awesome, you can donate to our Patreon. Donating $5 or more a month means that your name, with your permission, will be read at the end of the podcast. This week's current patrons are Laura Boylan, Chris Albury-Jones, Juke, and James Wartell. If for whatever reason you can't become a patron because life happens, I get it, then if you can take 5 minutes, log into iTunes, find the podcast, rate, and review it, that would be really, really helpful. It helps us get the podcast out there to new people, and it just, it's another general vote of support. I'd really, really appreciate it if you could do that. It takes 5 minutes. If you don't want to write a review, that's fine. Even just a rating, 5 stars, would be super helpful. Alright, that's all for this week. You will get a new column next Friday and another podcast episode in a fortnight. Thank you so much for listening. You've been listening to Non-Monogamy Help. Our podcast music has been provided by Chris Albury-Jones at albury-jones.com, and the art was made by Dom Jung at domduong.com. Thank you for listening.